Welcome back to our afternoon sessions of the First Sea Lord Sea Power Conference 2022. I hope that if you're here at Arundel House in London, you enjoyed your lunch. And if you're joining from elsewhere, I'm sure you found something useful to do with the time as well. Thank you for joining us for the next couple of sessions. My name is Bastian Giegerich. I'm the Director for Defense and Military Analysis here at the ISS, and it's my pleasure to chair this session. The title, as you know, is Contesting Waters Part 2, Complexity, Capability, Credibility. So we want to build on this morning's deliberations and the excellent kickoff that we had and explore a bit more the challenge of resetting for complex operations at sea, the transition from legacy to future systems, and the general question, of course, how to balance the fleet, how to balance the force overall. And it's my pleasure to welcome four excellent speakers who will help us to navigate these issues. We have Vice Admiral Martin Connell, the second Sea Lord, who, of course, has responsibility for delivering the Royal Navy's future capabilities and strategy. It's a pleasure to welcome Air Marshal Richard Knighton, the Deputy Chief of Defense Staff focused on military capabilities, who I imagine will speak more from a multi-domain perspective, perhaps, and then followed by Brian Clark, a Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he also directs the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology, and if I may add, himself a former naval officer, and will bring some of the US perspective and other international views into our discussion. And last but not least, Dr. Jeremy Sturs, Deputy Director of the Austrian Center for Intelligence, Propaganda and Security Studies, and author of a recent study with the title, The Future of European Naval Power and the High-End Challenge. Each of them will speak from this podium for about 7 or 8 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for a Q&A session, drawing on the online audience and, of course, on people here in the room. So let us look at building capability for the future, the challenges of transforming navies and militaries more generally, and the balance of risk while seeking innovative change to deliver effect in the future. And with that, I'll get out of the way, and Vice Admiral, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Bastian, and good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you've all enjoyed your sandwiches. Suffice to say, many of mine have been taken this morning. But I'm really grateful for the opportunity just to look at this complexity of a decade of transitions that we have ahead of us. And in doing so, I think it's just worth emphasizing that while it is incredibly exciting as we look to build the future Royal Navy, we are, of course, dealing with platforms and capabilities that have been in service many years. If I look at the SSBN that is generating later this year, HMS Vanguard, it was commissioned 30 years ago. If I look at the latest frigate that's come out of a deep upkeep, HMS Iron Duke, it was commissioned first 30 years ago. And we need lots of life out of those two important platforms for the decade ahead of us. So as Second Sea Lord, it's about balancing inevitably the demands of today's Navy, managing, in some cases, some challenging issues of obsolescence, while pivoting new capabilities at pace for the future. And what I'd like to do is just briefly talk about that under the three titles that have been given to us: complexity, capability, and credibility, and just to unwrap some thoughts that we have in our naval strategy. So first of all, complexity. What we are doing is, in some areas, embracing new technologies at pace and getting them into the hands of our sailors and Marines as quickly as we can. And where possible, we're doing that in operational theaters. Now, there's always a balance of risk that you have to consider here. At what stage do we think something is safe enough and is regulatory compliant enough for it to be useful in the hands of an operator? We don't want to put capabilities forward that have a caveat of constraints set around which they can, or more importantly, can't use them. Secondly, we're having to balance, like any other sector, industrial age capabilities with increasingly exciting information and data, and indeed modular age capabilities that we're fielding. And that requires, importantly, us to upskill our entire workforce this decade. That isn't just about different training courses for sailors. It is fundamentally changing the professions, skills, branches that frankly have served us well for decades. We're going to change all of those this decade. And we are going to change and upskill our civilian civil service workforce. And we're going to change the offer, the proposition for reserves. And then finally, as a Navy, we aspire to continue to operate in every domain, both crewed systems and uncrewed and increasingly autonomous systems in every domain this decade. So I hope that just gives a sense and a flavor of the complexity of what we're seeking to do in those transitions. Secondly, capability. In our draft Royal Navy strategy, it was talked about this morning, but the centrality is of course, sustaining our nuclear at-sea deterrent this decade while pivoting to the Dreadnought class coming in service later in this decade. But in addition to that, we've built in 10 design principles. Now, they are not tablets of stone, thou must. They are just design principles to help shape and inform how we're going to bring these new capabilities into service. Let me just give you a sense of 3 of them. And they have been touched on, unsurprisingly. First of all, interchangeability will be by design in everything we procure from now on. We have to be able to operate at the speed of relevance, particularly with our closest allies. We cannot afford to have exquisite systems that aren't compatible, interoperable, or of any use with our main allies. So interchangeability by design, we factored that into our CSG deployment last year, and Air Marshal Knighton and I will happily pick up on that in questions if you wish. That was a key tenet of that deployment and indeed that capability. Another design principle is prioritizing autonomy in everything we do, and we need to be able to scale that at pace. And we've done a heavy lift drone challenge recently where we've brought a different construct in order to provide some pump priming resource, bring some industrial partners in, give them a challenge and then scale it. And now we're putting it forward, not only trialing it, but operating it into operational theaters as well. Thirdly, we are investing in data exploitation systems. And the key reason is to give us decision superiority in terms of the timeliness of using data and reaching the right decision at the right time. Now that has a whole bunch of things associated with it, but fundamentally it's about getting better out of our current and indeed legacy networks. It's about packaging data in a smarter way. And it's also about moving knowledge and data around a wide theater. And then thirdly, about credibility. We continue to operate as a global Navy. That means we must be proficient in how we operate from the Arctic to the Antarctic and indeed all the other theaters that have been talked about today. We need to be able to be interchangeable, as I mentioned, with our NATO allies in particular, but also increasingly partners that we're going to operate in further afield. We also need to be ready and sustainable as a Navy. The size of Navy we have, of course, it catches the eye, but we can't have a Navy larger than that which we can sustain and operate. We deliberately set the bar very high for CSG-21. That is an initial operating capability which we deployed to the other side of the world during a global pandemic. And unsurprisingly, many of the challenges that we confronted there were about sustaining the logistical trail and the supply chain on the other side of the world. And many of our industry partners helped us on that. That, I hope, signals the way our future next generation support strategy will be positioned. And then finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, all of this, of course, is very exciting, but every day we're operating our nation's nuclear deterrent at sea, and we'll continue to prioritize for that. And I think it's just as relevant today as it was 50 years ago, and many of us perhaps would argue more so with everything going on. But that is why that's at the central part of our strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for outlining your thoughts. I hope that people take you up on the offer to speak a bit more in Q&A on that interchangeability and interoperability issue. But let me turn to Air Marshal Knighton, please.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me. You may be asking yourself the question why somebody wearing light blue is here today. I am a little, to be honest. And I think it's more than just demonstrating that the Centre of Defence and the Navy are on good speaking terms. It's also because I've spent 3.5 years in this role, and I hope that I'll be able to bring a bit of a defence perspective to the discussion today. When I took over this job, Steve Hillier, who was one of my predecessors, said to me, "You'll learn more about ships in this role than anything else." And 3.5 years on, he was absolutely right. It's been a great pleasure, actually, to be with the Navy on their journey as they thought about the future of their capability. And you might imagine after 3.5 years and quite a lot of bruising conversations, I've got some views. But whisper it quietly, I really enjoyed it, and it's really interesting. The thing I'm most proud of, actually, is the National Shipbuilding Strategy, which I think will have a profound impact on industry and on our capability as we look to the future. But it'll be nothing if we actually don't deliver on the promises that we made and make the changes that we need to make. And that will be a little bit of a theme of what I'll talk about today. So my approach is, I'm going to talk very briefly about the strategic context. I'll talk about the integrated operating concept as our conceptual response to that context. And I'll look at it from a maritime perspective. And I'm going to unashamedly throw out some challenges and questions for the maritime experts in the room and online to help us address. So let's start quickly then with the strategic context. What the integrated review concluded was that we are seeing the return of great power competition, and that we are facing an era of constant competition where we're being challenged both above and below the traditional threshold of war, and we're being challenged across all 5 operational domains, so including space, cyber, sea and air. What we also said was we are in a period of increased instability with greater risks. And all of this and all of the changes in from our potential adversaries is reducing the operational advantage that we have enjoyed in the West for many years. So our response to this conceptually was the integrated operating concept. And the IOPC drove a lot of our thinking about the prioritization for investment in the physical component, in hard capability. And there are 4 things I always single out about the integrated operating concept to help explain the judgments we made. The first is the continued importance of deterrence and the need as a consequence for hard power. The second is this idea of persistent engagement, the idea that we'll have more of our forces deployed more of the time in more places. The third is this idea of integration, multi-domain integration, across all 5 domains of operational domains, but also all the levers of power at our disposal. And then finally is this idea of adaptation, the speed by which we are able to adapt our capabilities to deal with the emerging threats and the pace of change of technology, which is increasing as more of it is drawn from commercially available sources. So I'll just quickly talk about each of those and some of the particular challenges. Let me start with this idea of deterrence and the need to be able to threaten our adversaries and hold them at risk. It's about credibility, capability, and communication. And there are 2 things that I would single out. The first is this idea of increased lethality. So what do we mean by lethality? Do we want, for example, our next destroyer, the Type 83, to be an offensive multi-role capability as well as a defensive capability? And what are we prepared to compromise and give up to enable it to do both of those tasks? The second issue I'd highlight under lethality is this idea of is hypersonics and hypersonic weapon capability. Wherever you look, this is a conversation about the risks that we face from potential development of hypersonics by other nations. But it is unbelievably expensive. So what are we prepared to give up to get into that game? And what exactly is the use case from a maritime perspective? You can make a use case, but is that the optimal solution? The second area under deterrence I want to just focus on is this idea of seabed warfare. This is one of those areas in the grey zone where we are facing this constant competition I described. We need to go and exploit commercially available technology to improve our understanding of what's going on the seabed. I need the Navy to go and buy their MROS as soon as possible and use the opportunities over the next year to exploit commercially available technology. But I don't think this can be a symmetrical battle of volume. And we need to think about innovatively about how we're going to deter activity on the seabed and how we're going to command and control our own assets to do that effectively. So let me move on to persistent engagement next. The Royal Navy's proposition through the Integrator review was most compelling around persistent engagement. It's kind of what you do and have been doing for hundreds of years. In the question, we talked about resetting to complex and demanding operations. I think that is a false choice. We must continue to do the persistent engagement as well as being able to be ready to fight and deter our adversaries. But my question, we covered a bit of this at the end of the previous session, is what is the Navy actually going to do and how will it know whether it's been successful? We have a limited number of assets and resources. Where are we going to employ them and how are we going to employ them to deliver the effect that we want? And then as an engineer, it would be remiss of me not to mention availability and how we're going to maximize the availability of the assets we have to deliver the maximum effect. But this third area is this idea of integration and multi-domain integration. I think the Royal Navy actually of the three services has the furthest to go in thinking about this. It's not about sprinkling space and cyber on top of the maritime domain or the air domain. It is about, and it's not even about integration as an end in itself. It's about enabling multi-domain operations, being able to outmaneuver our adversaries and unhinge them. A question, my challenge to the Navy is, how will you educate, train, and grow multi-domain operational commanders of the future that aren't wearing green uniform and in the Royal Marines? My final point then is around adaptation. And this is an area where I think the Navy is leading the way in defence. The work that Dan Cheeseman's doing on behalf of the team here is utterly remarkable. My challenge to all of defence is to say, how do we move beyond simple ideas and experiments and scale up and deliver capability into the hands of our sailors that they can actually go and use? And this is no better example of this, I think, than in the work that Phil Kelly's doing on the Future Maritime Air Force, FMAF. It is brilliant. It is absolutely the spirit of innovation that we see in wartime being brought to peacetime. It's fantastic. But I'm still waiting to the answers to my questions, which is, how do you integrate uncrewed systems launched off the deck of a carrier for tactical and operational effect? And what of this is actually funded beyond a few experiments? What is it that you'd like to fund if you could create the headroom, and what is it you just need loads of money from somewhere else to go and do? So my conclusion then is that I think the Royal Navy has emerged from the integrated review stronger, better, more confident, and much clearer about where it's going. And I have been enormously proud to be part of that journey. The service is proving itself to be innovative, it's challenging itself, and I've been impressed with the boldness of the proposals. But we have to turn the rhetoric into reality. We need to be able to do that if we're going to deliver sea power in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, Marshall, thank you so much for outlining and proposing these questions around deterrence, persistent engagement, multi-domain integration, and adaptation, which I'm sure will spark debate in the Q&A session. Let me now turn to Brian Clark, who has a few slides and he has a clicker. Yep. Very good. Okay, Brian, over to you.
Great, thank you, Bastian. If you could bring up the slides. I'm here from the United States. I'm your token American. I'm going to try to bring you some of the perspective on what's going on in Washington right now with regard to some of the tension between what the services have been trying to do over the last several years and what they're going to be forced to do in the future, some of the tension between distribution and concentration. We've talked a little bit about that already today. Also, I'm very happy to be here on the anniversary of the Falklands War as a submariner it's the one of the few times we can actually talk about our achievements. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about, in terms of the United States and what's happening with defense strategy right now, this is what drives 90% of the conversation, is the concern about China, its capability, its capacity, how that's grown over the last 20 years. This shows from some work we did with DARPA what China's military looked like in the late 90s, what it looks like and will look like in the next few years in terms of the size and the modernization that it's been able to pursue. For the United States Navy, you can see that the force that we have in the Pacific Theater on any given day does not change dramatically in the last 25 years. There's going to be some, obviously, more capabilities that are brought to bear if there was a war on. But the challenge is each one of those ships now has to be more and more survivable, more and more lethal to be able to make a difference up against this more formidable foe. That has led to trying to create individual ships that are more and more capable, more expensive. They are then going to consume a large amount of resources, and the fleet is becoming smaller and more concentrated instead of more distributed and larger. This is something that Admiral Gilday will maybe allude to in his discussion later today, but it might be worth bringing this up in the Q&A, is how do you reconcile this challenge with the need for a larger Navy that he argues for? So this drives the Navy towards a more concentrated fleet that's more survivable and more lethal on an individual basis. At the same time, though, we have other things we need to be able to do with the Navy. And China is unfortunately not the only case in which we have to deal with this challenge. The recent events in the Ukraine war have highlighted the lethality and capability that you could pull together using commercially available systems, both surveillance and targeting satellites and UAVs, as well as homegrown precision-guided weapons like the Neptune cruise missile that the Ukrainians built. These capabilities are going to be more and more proliferated, more and more prevalent throughout the operating environment. So it's not just China with its massive number of precision-guided weapons that's the challenge we have to worry about. It's the fact that this is going to be the case in almost every confrontation we encounter. A capable threat may be operating from shore that's able to impose lethal effects on ships at sea at relatively long distances, making littoral an extended and more extended range of environments. So then the difficulty that we're going to face is this proliferation has essentially resulted in the culmination of the precision strike and stealth competitive regime that the United States started during the late Cold War. If you think of kind of how military competitions have evolved over the last century, we had industrial capacity during the world wars that kind of led to victory for one side or the other. We then transitioned to nuclear weapons being the discriminating factor, and then we then mounted an effort with stealth and precision weapons in the United States to be able to get an advantage over Soviet forces. This phase, if you'll see on the S-curve, is now reaching that top part of the S-curve where it's flat. Everybody's got comparable capabilities. Now you have to think about a new way to compete. What is the next way or the next competitive regime that we're going to move into? This is the challenge for the United States, is that we're still inside this phase of stealth and precision weapons. We're up against a Chinese threat and then multiple other threats that have the same capabilities. Continuing to build a fleet that's designed around more survivable ships with greater lethality is going to result in a smaller and smaller force that will then have less resilience and be able to operate in fewer places at one time. Arguably, the Chinese and Russians have already started to think about that next competitive regime. What we've seen over the last decade with gray zone operations at sea and ashore reflect this understanding that the precision weapons capabilities are merely there to help backstop or provide an overwatch for gray zone operations that can happen underneath. These operations will allow you to create influence and territory at your opponent's loss over a longer period of time, but you still achieve the objectives you want to achieve. And then you can ramp that up, as Russia did, when you decide that you want to escalate to be able to achieve a larger number of effects in a shorter period of time. What this does is essentially mean that these smaller, more lethal units are able to achieve effects that are outsized compared to what we had in the past. In the past, we would have had to have a much larger operation, be able to accomplish the objectives that a smaller force can accomplish today. So we've seen with the Ukrainian forces, they've been able to actually take advantage of this trend towards smaller, more lethal units being capable, using precision weapons and commercial satellite and commercial ISR capabilities to build their own battle networks and kill chains. This is great. We celebrate it when we watch it as they defeat the Russians, but just as easily, these capabilities could be turned against us. And we have to think about the fact that this is now the playing field. We're going to be encountering this kind of lethal, highly capable force, no matter where we operate and at various levels of escalation. So we need to start thinking about how do we operate across that ladder, because today, arguably, Western navies, like the United States Navy, don't have a lot of rungs on that lower part of the escalation ladder. So when you go up against a force that's small, capable, lethal, your capability and response is going to be a destroyer, a carrier strike group, something large and disproportionate to the confrontation. It makes maybe the United States or the Western Navy seem like the aggressor, and the Navy that has maybe started the conflict in the gray zone as the victim. So this asymmetry of escalation is something that the United States military and Navy in particular are trying to wrestle with as they do their force planning, and is a feature that's reflected in the National Defense Strategy that was just completed and in the budget that was just released and provided to Capitol Hill. So the way the U.S. is moving is moving away from the idea of attrition and lethality and survivability as being the primary discriminators for success, and instead focusing on gaining decision-making advantages. How can we put our opponents into dilemmas that they don't have easy ways out from? How can we create opportunities for ourselves and that we can then exploit? And how do we create a more resilient force that's able to fight its way through and look for those opportunities and exploit them when they emerge? So this idea of moving away from just shooting it out, toe-to-toe with your opponent, which was the approach that the U.S. was mounting even until just a couple of years ago, is now giving way to this focus on decision-making as being the discriminating factor in victory in a war of the future. So this is kind of where the United States is going, and this is implied by the defense strategy that was just released. But this idea that we need to think differently about how do we deter aggression in the future. So this four-part strategy is our distillation of what's happening right now within the department. So first, this idea of contesting every move. So the war in Ukraine revealed to the United States that they can't let gray zone operations fester as they have in Europe and in the Asia Pacific for the last 10 years. Or eventually your opponent feels like they can grab more and maybe escalate to an operation that you're not prepared to counter. So this idea of persistent engagement that U.S. Cyber Command has used effectively is now looking to be employed more broadly through the U.S. military. And then second, you still have to hold your enemy's strategic systems at risk, not just like nuclear command and control necessarily, but the things they need to be successful in a larger operation, like logistics, like their ability to maintain network connectivity. And then third, increase costs, but not necessarily attempt to deny a conflict from being successful. So the deterrence by denial approach has given way to an idea of just imposing costs on your opponent. So we're not trying to build a steel ring around Taiwan, for example. We're just trying to increase the cost of an invasion and then combine it with other activities to try to create enough of a perception on the opponent's part that the cost isn't worth the gain. And then the last thing, which is maybe the most controversial part, is attempting to build an effort at dissuasion. So essentially this idea of campaigning, which is in the US defense strategy, is intended to drive a machine, if you will, of instrumenting your opponent to see what they're doing, taking actions that then attempt to dissuade them, looking at how those actions are reacted to by your opponent, and then building that cycle. The recent activity you saw with Russia, where the US released a lot of intelligence about the upcoming operation and then used US actions to try to deter Putin, is an example of this dissuasion machine in action. So this is the kind of nascent effort that the US is moving towards in terms of how do you deter conflict in the future? How do you move towards a campaign model that's built around decision-making advantages rather than one built around attrition? So then to get to the Navy. So in terms of navies, you're seeing this transition in the US Navy away from a small number of large multi-mission Death Stars towards a larger number of less multifunctional, maybe less capacity-driven platforms. This is the difficult transition that Admiral Gilday is trying to mount right now, because in an environment of fiscal constraint, you can't buy all the new things and keep all the old things. You've got to do some kind of shift, and that pivot is what is driving a lot of the controversy right now on the Hill between Congress and the US military. But moving towards the larger number of unmanned platforms in your force, reducing the number of large multi-mission manned platforms is essential to getting this more distributed fleet that gives you more tools at lower levels of escalation and also gives you more ways that you can compose the force to create dilemmas for an opponent. And then an essential element of this, which gets to the technology, the biggest technology challenge for the United States is how to implement what we would call human command with machine control. Humans have to still be in charge. I need to be able to manage this much larger force, which has a much more diverse combination of manned and unmanned units. How do I build courses of action and mission plans around that? And then how do I control them and manage them through the course of an operation? The lower part of this chart is all about software-defined a software-defined ecosystem that does the communications between objects, builds the mission plans that they would follow, and then monitors their actions in real time. This is something the commercial world has mastered and we experience every day when we use technology, but it's something that the military has to embrace, and we can talk about some of the details there. So in the end, what the US is trying to do is reestablish some rungs on the escalation ladder at lower levels of escalation by exploiting these trends towards more capable and smaller and lethal systems by getting them into the force and then making this transition away from a smaller force of larger things towards a larger force of smaller things. Combining that with electromagnetic warfare, cyber warfare, and this dissuasion machine is intended to give them the ability to reduce some of the rungs on the escalation ladder for your opponent and get an escalation dominance back towards the US side. And with that, we can talk about things during the Q&A.
Brian, thank you so much for outlining the US thinking and the direction of travel there as pacing threats develop, as new challenges emerge. I think that's a very useful addition to our conversation. I'll now turn to Jeremy for the final presentation from the panel. Jeremy, over to you. I think we also have a couple of slides which we need to pull up.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, admirals, generals, esteemed colleagues. It's an honor to be here. I was asked to discuss some perspectives on future threats, challenges, capability requirements, and particularly given my background in the research of European naval forces, to look at future capabilities, designs, trajectories of European navies, and I'm happy to oblige. So what I plan on doing is presenting three key challenges in regard to the higher environment and what that means for smallish navies. And then I will go to the second part of my presentation, and my today is trajectories, requirements, future fleet design. So I'm drawing from my study that I concluded last year on these challenges and looking at the various forces, maritime forces across Europe. And I would like to broaden the discussion a little bit, as we very often talk about allies and partners, but then we quickly forget about small allies and partners if it comes to multi-domain operations at scale against peer competitors. So we've heard already in the introductory remarks today, and several of our colleagues have talked about this as well, is that the changes to the international global order and great power competition has significant consequences for several states and for most states on this planet. In particular, with major powers, and I'm speaking about the US first and foremost, but also China and to a lesser degree Russia, developing their armed forces towards a high-end capability creates capability thresholds that are rising, and I will show you a slide in just a second. And with this rising capability thresholds, it's very difficult for smaller forces, for smaller states to keep in the wake, so to speak, of these larger powers and to be able to contribute to multi-domain operations. This is just a basic graph to show you the complexity, and there are many different graphs out there. And piggybacking off of what was just said, yes, there is a lot of interchangeability. Yes, there is a lot of interoperability. NATO is more aligned than it probably ever has been, and can operate better than it ever has. But if you're looking at what the US is actually thinking, it just showed us that slide. I'm really concerned that small states will not be able to keep up. And if you look at the next capabilities that are in the pipeline, from the Ford carriers, MQ-25, next generation air defense, B-21, the next generation of I-STAR elements, across then the massive standoff capabilities. I see massive problems for small states and their armed forces to plug into this multi-domain operation. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge, let's maybe one more, we might want to add something. Also, if you have to think about the home game and the away game, as well as the high end. In platforms as well as in people. And this is just to show you the difference between European navies and the US Navy on the right-hand side in terms of total tonnage. And there are a couple qualifying elements that we can add here, but it's just to give us an idea of the limitations we're talking about. However, in the multipolar era we are moving into, medium and small states will have more agency in the maritime domain. Remember late Eric Grove's book, The Future of Naval Power, I think it was in 1990s he wrote it, where there was still this hierarchy of naval forces. And if you were at the bottom of this totem pole, you had no say in the maritime domain. I think this period is over. Small states will have more say. But if you think about this lack of critical mass, and I just have a couple examples. Portugal, a submarine flotilla of 2 submarines. Denmark, 5 surface combatants, 5 large surface combatants. When the Helge Ingstad sank in 2017, Norway lost 25% of its frigate fleet. There is simply no surge capacity. So how do you prepare to fight tonight, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow? As the title of this panel suggests, if you have nothing left to fight with. And the next is the lack of fires, effective fires, both defensive and offensive fires. And it was mentioned already by the Air Marshal and several others in this room today. I do believe Europe is suffering from, and European states are suffering from, a missile gap. Now, again, here, this can be qualified. I've received significant flack for this graph because I don't go into the different types of vertical launch system cells that there are, but this gives you a rough indication of where European navies stand in total if you look at fires, both defensive and offensive. There's a lot of talk about DF-26, the YJ-21, Zircon, Hypersonic. Almost everything appears to be dubbed a carrier killer nowadays. I'm quite frustrated about that, to be honest. But what it does prove is that anti-ship missiles and missiles in general are very dangerous to platforms. And our Western way of the militaries are built is based on major platforms, be it at sea, but also C2 nodes, infrastructure, tankers, bigwing, I-STAR, and the likes. So I do think we have an issue of being able to effectively fire first. I think that is definitely the case, that we lack the defensive fires as well as the offensive fires. At the same time, they are very expensive. If you're a small state, you can only afford so many precision munitions. In particular, then if there are offensive fires, long-range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles are even more expensive. And of course, they also have a political consideration to them as well in terms of risk escalation. Let's shift to trajectory of European navies. And I have this graph I used in my study, and you see here both the capabilities and the size thresholds that are increasing and make it more difficult for small and smallest navies, small high-performing navies, and medium-sized navies to be able to contribute to the multi-domain fight. And this just is a very rudimentary graph. In terms of trajectory, if you look at where European navies have been moving since 2014, which I believe is the nadir of European naval power, maybe even in history, it's a slow and steady upwards trajectory with a lot of hiccups, a lot of stagnation in some aspects, but in general, there is an upward trend. However, there are very few discernible trends visible that there is a major consolidation in the defense, naval and defense industry. And for example, just to exemplify that, there are currently 14 programs by 12 European states in final or already on final stages or on the way, delivering the next generation of surface combatants. There are 10 different designs, 12 countries, 14 different projects. So there is, of course, there has been some consolidation, but not to the extent, and I don't see it happening in the next 20, 30, 40 years either. What I would like to move on to now is that the future fleet design and how to square this triangle of challenges, multi-domain operations, critical mass, and the lack of effective fires. Of course, there is not a cookie cutter. I don't have that cookie cutter with me that would be applicable for the Bulgarian Navy, the Swedish Maritime Forces, and the Royal Navy. However, what can be said is that the future force design will be evolutionary and I believe not revolutionary. I think that's also something we've taken away from the discussions today already. There will be an integration of unmanned platforms, but the larger European states and their navies will continue to focus on relatively well-balanced and blended fleets around a nucleus of large platforms. And the size of the platforms, as we heard today, are also increasing. The next German destroyer will be a more than 10,000 tons displacement. The next Italian destroyer more than 10,000 tons. So there is this increase in size, but technology will allow smaller states to attain a greater degree of naval capability, I believe, through off-the-shelf technology in terms of drones, C4ISR. But I have to say, and that's something that's a little bit of a bee in my bonnet, I think European navies across the board have been very slow in integrating unmanned platforms. You just have to look at the German Navy, it struggles. The French Navy, the Italian Navy, it's taken very long. 2011, already we realized in Libya that you need these capabilities, and it's taken a long time. So to sum up, naval forces for medium and small states across Europe will face challenges to effectively contribute to multi-domain operations, and will be extremely difficult to stay in the wake of the US Navy in particular. They have a slow and steady upward trajectory, but in particular, it will be interesting to see how European navies will have to navigate and deepen their relationship with the US Navy, all the while being more dependent on European navies. So in other words, there will be greater capability, or they will need greater capabilities independent of the US Navy, but then when push comes to shove, they will have to be more integrated with the US forces. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much for your attention.
Jeremy, thank you very much for adding that layer to our discussion, and starting, or one of your starting points was that interoperability challenge in a multi-domain world for some of the smaller European navies. That's also a point where you concluded, which I think ties in nicely, even if from a challenging perspective, into some of the other things that have been said. So we've got a good 30 minutes for discussion now, and I invite questions and comments. A few are being formed online, but I'll go to the room here first. If we can get a microphone here in the front first, Paul Rimmer. And then if I can get a couple, yeah, okay, we've got, okay, let's take a few from the room. Paul.
Thank you very much. For all the things that you described, there's been a lot of emphasis on, delivering capability at pace. First Sea Lord earlier talked about, the triad of performance, time, and cost, that there's trade space and the cost space. So procurement's not always been our finest hour. I'd just perhaps look at the military speakers, whether you can say something about how we're going to overcome the sort of problems that have bedeviled us in the past, and that long list of European countries procuring large platforms individually. Does that suggest that we're not going to be in a space where we're prepared to give up a national capability and buy things overseas? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me get in one more question. If we can get the microphone here to Alessandro. There we go.
Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. So I'll take your offer and ask you, both Admiral and Air Marshal, what does interchangeability mean to you, and how does, in practical terms, sort of materializes, particularly in areas outside NATO and the major sort of alliance framework, whether with the United States or with other European partners, and in particular, how interchangeability, from your perspective, helps honing in this broader requirement within the integrated review of using unilateral, different type of formations, and how you translate the power of different multilateral formations into something that is militarily effective. Very briefly to Brian, thank you so much for your presentation. From what you were saying, did I hear you correctly that basically what the US Navy is looking at is to surrender to an extent deterrence by denial and shift towards deterrence by punishment?
Thank you so much. Let's start with those points. I suggest perhaps I'll invite the Vice Admiral and the Air Marshal to respond to that easy question of how to fix procurement, and then but then also pick up respond to Sandro's invitation to say a bit more about interchangeability, interoperability. Then we'll get to Brian on the specific point that was just raised, and I wonder whether, Jeremy, whether I can ask you to perhaps also say a few words about that challenging picture of 14 programs from 12 nations, and what one might do about that. What ideas for consolidation and cooperation, coordination might be out there. But Vice Admiral, over to you.
So in terms of procurement, I think there are strategic programs that, by their very nature, there's a political dimension to those, a huge industrial dimension, prosperity dimension. And what we need for those is, no surprises, deliver on time. And we are absolutely fixated on achieving the schedule, because those legacy systems I talked about, I don't want them operating a day longer than they must. So the strategic program is about delivery on time and certainty, and that requires transparency and a good dialogue between government, Navy, and industry. But I think at a lower level, I think we have more freedoms than perhaps often we think we do. And we have financial freedoms, and we're discussing that very actively with the MOD about what we actually can do. Clearly, it's got to be within a very clear commercial framework, but we've got commercial freedoms and financial freedoms that we need to exploit better. And I'll give you just one example. We had one way of looking at a counter UAS system that was multi-year, extremely expensive. One might even say exquisite. And we went another route, which was, I think, good enough and very quick. And we had the freedoms, both commercially and financially, to do that. And it was delivered in months. So, I think it's about exploiting what we can do. But yeah, this is something that I think all of us are wrestling with. I would just say on the interchangeability, so I look at it across all lines of development. It's about how we think doctrine, it's about how we educate our people. I did quite a bit of my education in the United States, and that network has been extremely useful to me. Admiral Ignacio there, one of my classmates, you grow up with that cohort, and many of them rise to senior positions. So, there's that dimension to it. Then there's the more operational dimension. If we look at the deployment last year, I don't think there are many nations that can have another nation's highest end capability, like an F-35B squadron, embarked in another nation's ship, like the US Marine Corps did with us. And it was not just tokenistic. We had their munitions in our deep magazines. And behind that is a level of, what about the assurances and compliancy that we need to put another nation's munition in a ship? It's tough, but you get through it, and it's hard work. But the benefit is, think of the problem sets that we're now imposing on other nations. They go, hang on a minute, they can launch a jet from that deck, they can bounce it off another deck, and they can appear in an objective that we haven't thought about. So I think that was, albeit an IOC capability, but it does, I hope, give a sense of how those opportunities are. And as we speak today, I have Royal Navy sailors in US submarines and pilots on US carriers on operations. So, you've got there's a seed corn element here which works both ways, and it's not just US, but I'm giving that as the example because it's one which I've worked closely on.
So to Paul's question, I have in my 3.5 years spent quite a long time in front of the Public Accounts Committee debating with Marc Francois about his judgment that the system is broken, and I don't agree. But what I do agree is this is hard. And it's hard in every country that tries to do it. I think it's 13 reviews of procurement of the acquisition system in the UK over the last 40 or so years. And that's not because all of our predecessors were stupid. It's because it's really hard for a whole bunch of reasons that are intrinsic to the nature of the challenge, the technology we need, and frankly, the industrial politics associated with it. What we have done since the 1980s, when we came out of the cost plus contracting regime, is build a system that controlled as far as it could for cost. And actually, if you look at the hard evidence and the performance and past some of the rhetoric, actually the control of cost across the portfolio is really very good. We're less good at controlling for time. And that balance needs to shift, because the pace of change of technology and the ability of our adversaries to adapt quickly is leading to the risk that we will lose the operational advantage that we enjoy. And we need to be able to deliver these capabilities faster. And you do not govern your way to delivering capabilities faster. You have to let go, and you have to delegate to lower levels in the way that Martin described. I do also wonder whether we have built a scrutiny and approvals and program management methodology that's optimized for 20th century capability when we're trying to actually bring into service 21st century capability. And so there is definitely a case for multiple approaches depending on what we are trying to deliver. One thing that the 13 reviews has proved, I think, is there is no silver bullet. It's about continuous improvement and exploiting the opportunities and freedoms that Martin has described. On interchangeability and interoperability, the only thing I'd add is standards. If you do that, that will get you a long way to improving interoperability.
Thank you very much. Brian, let's pick up the point that Assemble made, and perhaps you can say a bit more about the potential trade-offs that the US sees or doesn't see in that space.
Yeah. So the US is begrudgingly moving away from deterrence by denial. I mean, so they don't want to say it like that, but that's what we're doing. And it's because of the realization that denying a country like China the ability to invade Taiwan is probably not realistic under any normal budget. So they're coming to try to some new conclusions. So deterrence by punishment is the other side of the coin that we often throw out there. They don't find that to be particularly satisfying though. And the issue is, as we saw with Russia, you can threaten all kinds of punishment, but unless they find that to be intolerable or they find it credible, they're not going to react to that. So the expectation is Russia, China, and many other adversaries are not going to find US threats credible, or if they do, they're going to just build themselves, bulwark themselves so that they're ready to sustain that. So that's why they've come to this sort of new middle ground, if you will, of integrated deterrence, which is all about, I called it the dissuasion machine, but it's the idea that I'm going to use multiple tools in the toolkit and orchestrate them, and I'm going to instrument my enemy. And kind of the key part of this is understanding what your opponent is doing and thinking at a very deep level. So it means intelligence penetration is an important element of it. And then you have to then assess how they're reacting and be able to build your plan as you go, which they tried to do with Russia. And that was kind of just the first foray into it. But that would be the approach going forward, is try to dissuade your opponent from taking a course of action instead of trying to deter them through some much more outward expression of military capability.
Right, thank you very much. Jeremy, do you want to say a few words about? Yeah.
Well, in terms of consolidation, and many of you will be aware of the projects of the last decades. There are, of course, several that stand out in terms that could be considered success stories in cooperation across Europe. The Friends, maybe the NH90, despite all the hiccups that went into that. but all of them were, or many of them were based in a Cold War thinking, NATO replacement frigate 90. And then if you think about it, even during a period of fiscal restraint and the pressure on military forces throughout the 1990s and the 2000s in decline, they were still the nations and the states were still willing to invest in their own defense sector. And I don't see all too many trends that would suggest that will change anytime soon. Look at the PESCO projects. Most of them are very defensive. We don't know how far the corvette will move forward. So large platforms, complex systems will continue, in my opinion, to be either bilateral, a couple maybe unilateral arrangements, but by and large, it won't be a European joint venture, so to speak. Also because alliance procurement policy is alliance policy, and the US have a big say in that as well.
And I suppose, Jeremy, I mean, an additional challenge will then be some of these nations now have a bit more money available than they thought they would. Will they spend this side by side or in any way, in any more coordinated way? I guess we'll see. Can we get the microphone, please, here for a second round? First one over here, row 4, yeah. And then after that, we'll go to the back of the room. I think, Ben, was that you? Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much, Alex Burton, Rebellion Defence. It's great having perhaps one of the financial authors for the Integrator review alongside at least one of the single services deliverers on that review here. When the review was announced, it was hugely positively reported, but sort of underneath a very strong positivity of capital build, there was a sort of codicil of flat operational spending for the following 5 years. That was when inflation was sort of down at almost 2%. We're now at 6%. Could perhaps both of you sort of bring to life how you intend to deliver the ambitions of the speakers this morning on persistence alongside probably a suppressed operational budget?
Thank you very much. And then we'll take one more from, yeah, Ben Berry.
I'm from the ISS. I'd like to follow on Alex's question, because I think you've got a really big challenge with the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force's manpower. The manpower of all 3 services was significantly reduced as a result of the integrated review. But it seems to me all this persistent engagement, multi-domain integration, interagency work, grey zone work requires quality people interfacing with all sorts of different partners. Now, the other aspect of the integrated review that bears on this is that none of the armed forces reserves were given any uplift in capability and readiness, which would have given you a hedge against your declining manpower. Are you underestimating the challenge for both the Navy and that part of the Air Force that supports it?
Thank you very much. Let's take those 2 interventions, and I'll turn to the Admiral and the Air Marshal to have a go at these. Air Marshal, do you want to start this round actually? So there's a point about, is inflation eating our persistent engagement and some of the other ambitions that were outlined, and then the direct challenge on the manpower question from Ben. Yeah, Marshall.
I saw Mr. Elwood had left. I didn't realise I was going to get the same kind of tough questioning from a friend of mine as the chair of the Defence Select Committee. It's just a matter of simple arithmetic that inflation is going to put pressure on our plans. We just don't know yet what that is. Quite a lot of our contracts are firm priced, and which you might argue insulates defence from the impact of inflation. But let's be honest, if a company can't bear the cost of that inflation through the firm price, and we don't want, because of the industrial capacity and capability that we need for those companies to be bankrupted, we are going to have to address that. So probably the single biggest threat to our ability to deliver the plans is the impact of inflation. We just don't know what that's going to be quite yet. The specific point about the operational budget being broadly flat is absolutely true, but that is actually quite manageable given the workforce, which I'll come to Ben's point in a minute, the workforce numbers that we've got. There's not any intention to spend less on activity or spend less on support. In fact, quite the opposite. Because the resource, the running cost budget for defence is made up heavily of workforce costs, and there is a reduction in the cost of the workforce. But again, that will be affected by whatever the Armed Forces Pay Review Body says about what the pay should be. So you're right to hone in on it. It is a strategic issue for us, but it's too early to understand what the position will be. Just to Ben's point, so a couple of things, Ben. Firstly, actually, the Navy will be about the same size at the end of the decade as it is now, and actually it's growing over the next few years. So it's not quite your contention or assumption at the start of your question isn't quite right. The second thing I'd say is that I'm actually really quite confident about the ability of the Air Force and the Navy to live within their workforce headcount plans and their cost envelopes. Because of the detailed analysis that was undertaken going through the integrated review and as part of the spending round that went with it. We have not exploited the opportunities of automation in defence anywhere near as much as we should, or anywhere near as much as comparable organisations in the private sector have, and that is part of the approach that we must take. And on the reserves point, actually, there is a change in the readiness state of the reserves, particularly in the land domain, and that's fundamental to the future soldier programme and the Army's modernisation programme. I do feel, however, that there is yet more to be done in terms of exploiting the latent capacity and capability of the reserve, particularly as in high technology areas where we quite frankly can't either attract or retain that talent on a permanent basis. The problem, I think, actually, the biggest, most strategic issue for us is not around numbers or readiness of the reserve. It's actually about skills. Everywhere I look across the programs we're trying to deliver, we are coming under pressure because of the absence of trained and qualified engineers and technologists to actually deliver the projects and programs that we need. And that is a national problem for us to address, and not something the armed forces can do on its own.
Thank you. Vice Admiral.
Just to build on that, so I, as Second Sea Lord, have a bigger budget than any of my predecessors have had. So yes, it's a growing capital budget. The Ardell pressures are there, but as Richard said, we're going to have to do things differently. In some cases, fundamentally differently. We have a couple of programs in place, but one of those is deliberately focusing frontline roles first. Now that makes sense. Why weren't we doing it before? Well, we were taking some risk in areas. We can no longer afford to do that. Where the multi-crewing that's being talked that is becoming much more in all of our ships, submarines, and indeed squadrons and commanding units, how we move people around so that we can sustain capability forward. We can't afford to have gaps in those models. So it's important as a principle we fill all of those. And then I look at every headquarters role and think, does that need to be filled by a military person of that rank and that specialization? And all of us, I think, perhaps can become a bit lazy in saying, can you send me a Navy captain as a nuclear engineer because I need a project manager? No, you need a project manager. You just need some expertise on nuclear, because the pyramid that grows a captain with that sort of knowledge, that costs me, and I can't afford to do it. So we've got to be smarter about how we put people in key positions. But yeah, there is a undoubted, particularly with the inflationary pressures, challenge, but it's a challenge that I welcome. A growing budget, a growing ambition, growing Navy, both in tonnage. I mean, the people point, we've got to be smarter on our modeling. It's remarkable how we come up with a new ship, new submarine, and the baseline assumption is it's the same as that which has gone before. Take the aircraft carriers. I remember when I asked, why is it this particular number? And the answer was that was broadly the same number as the CBS. And we've refined it, but it's still about a third of what the crew of a Nimitz class carrier is. And some of my US Navy colleagues thought we were bonkers. Now, I think even they are thinking, hang on, if they can do this and sustain that on the other side of the world and have a reasonable tempo of operations, where can we learn from what they've done? So we've got to be smarter in our modeling. I think a growing Navy is going to place some challenges on the workforce we've got. We're asking a lot of some of our sailors and Marines in terms of nights away, submariners in particular right now. So we've got to grow the submarine force. And we can't afford as a Department of Navy to be arguing that over the ones and twos. The principle of that is we're a growing Navy, and it takes time, as the First Sea Lord said, to grow a nuclear watchkeeper. So it's a healthy debate that we're having, but we've got more freedoms now in terms of the whole force, cost of the whole force and what we can do. I have the authority today to change a military person to a civil servant, and we're doing that in a number of ways. So it's going to be a challenge, but it's one, for the time being at least, I think we're cracking.
Thank you so much. Can I invite Jeremy and Brian both to perhaps add a few words to this also from your perspective?
I just would want to pick up on the topic of personnel and future fleet design, because in the last couple of years I've been across Europe and talked to many naval leaders, and there are a few states that don't have personnel issues and problems getting in both retention and recruitment. And I think what a lot of people are now relapsing into, and even senior naval leaders are relapsing into it. I'm not talking about this room, but in conversations I've had in other countries, of now where their budgets are rising, particularly in Germany, for example, with this 100 billion that have been earmarked, let's say it that way. I've heard senior defense officials say, well, we'll need 5 more corvettes, 2 more frigates, 4 more submarines. And I would argue that that might not be the smartest way of going about future fleet design. I'll leave it at that.
In the U.S. perspective, manpower is a big consideration right now. That's one of the reasons the fleet is shrinking. As a matter of fact, the Navy is getting ready to retire, wants to retire 9 of the littoral combat ships that it just bought. And part of the reason is to be able to make the surface warfare sailors available for other parts of the surface fleet that have significant manning gaps right now. So manpower is one of the constraints on the size of the U.S. Navy. And to your point, Admiral, one of the reasons is they've been insufficiently applied automation or applied it in ways that weren't very effective. So I think littoral combat ship is a great example of a ship that was extremely complicated and difficult to operate. And they also tried to reduce its manning. So those two things don't necessarily go together. So if you're going to have smaller ships, they need to be less complex and maybe do fewer missions so that you're going to get away with a smaller crew. That's one of the things we're trying to work through right now as we try to think about this transition towards a more distributed fleet, and why unmanned vessels offer an opportunity to maybe break that mold, because even though the unmanned ship theoretically still has people associated with it, its lower number of functions and its less sophisticated nature might mean that the people associated with that ship are much less than would be associated with a manned version of that same platform.
Thank you very much. We've got about 7 minutes left or so, so I'll take 1 or 2 of our online questions. But if we have more people who would like to get in the room, we'll take those as well. So I see one more in the room. We'll get that in this final round. Let me just pull out 1 or 2 from the online audience. Tom Cope, and it goes. The first one goes back to that issue of the workforce, skills, and personnel in general. Tom Cope is asking, bearing in mind that our overall personnel plot will likely continue to shrink, how best can we enable personnel at the lowest possible level to engage in meaningful decision-making about the capabilities they will end up deploying with? So, and how can one push this further down, and in which ways is the question. A second question goes more in the direction of technology, technology insertion, data exploitation, automation, and it's from Mark Sheehan of MBDA UK. And Mark is asking, anti-ship weapon systems are becoming significantly faster. Hypersonics was mentioned, and more stealthy. Previously, we've always enjoyed the command function to approve a defensive weapons engagement. Do we think that the reducing reaction time means we need to push further forward automated functions, thus potentially removing command approval decision and relying more on supporting technology in that way? And then we have a question here in the room. If I can get a microphone, please. The lady in the middle there, yes. There you go.
Hi, Sophie Anthropos. Just a question. both Air Marshal Knighton and Admiral McConnell mentioned deterrence, and I'm aware of the fact that the Defence Command paper referenced the fact that NATO had successfully reinvigorated its deterrence in the light of Russian activity since 2014. Clearly, possibly a little over-optimistic, given what's happened. And I'm aware that there's discussion within military circles about reinvigorating discussions again around deterrence, particularly integrated deterrence, and that relates to the American policy on that, but also looking at right from grey zone up to conventional, up to nuclear, and that more integrated ladder as well. And I just wondered where we are politically on that. It seems like a real opportunity right now to reinvigorate this conversation with politicians who haven't recently been that interested in the subject, and clearly even since 9/11 have had their attention elsewhere. So I just would particularly welcome your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. So let's give every panelist, and I'm advance warning, I'm going to go in reverse order. Let's give everybody a 60-second burst to engage with this final set of questions around deterrence, around automation and autonomy automation, and the workforce and involvement in decision making on those capability questions. Anything you want to pick up from those three, Jeremy?
I might want to just start with deterrence, and I know this is a Royal Navy setting. It's the largest European Navy setting, but I always look to smaller states as well, and in particular in regard to the current crisis in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, looking at what's the next step for like a Bulgarian Navy, a Romanian Navy, Polish Navy, and so on, and how can actually they build and interact, build a fleet and interact with larger European navies and alliance navies to actually contribute to deterrence. Because if they are tried it on day one of this multi-domain operation, if they don't have any surge capacity, if it's a rerun of 2008, 2014, and 2022 of the Georgian and the Ukrainian naval forces, then they won't add to deterrence. And that's, I think, something we need to think about as well, even although our focus is on our own services. But as an alliance, we have to think about how we can support them and encourage them to make the right decisions. That's all from me.
Jeremy, thank you. Brian.
On deterrence, I think we do well at the very high end. So the nuclear deterrent is intact for the players that we're talking about here, but it's everything underneath that. All those rungs on the escalation ladder. You still have to deter at those levels as well. And I think we've sort of lost the bubble on the fact that deterrence isn't just about existential conflict. It's about deterring aggression at various levels. And then I would say on automation that we're finding, at least in the United States, and this is work that we actually are doing with DARPA right now, is it's about a relationship between the human and the machine, and that where the human ends and the machine starts, that spectrum is moving. We're giving the machines more and more authority to be able to act based on guidance and direction provided by a human in advance. So the human has to think through what kinds of bounds and what kinds of guidance do I want to give the machine, and the machine will take actions on its own, but it's not the same as in the past where you would press the button and the missile would launch. It's more about, I got to define a course of action for the machine will then follow that. So that spectrum between human and machine is changing as machines become more capable, and the speed of warfare, the need for decision-making advantage grows.
So on deterrence, I think it depends which country you sit in. I think in Estonia or Lithuania, the thought of deterrence in the minds of politicians was at the front of their minds. I can offer you a lot of reassurance that this is a topic of much greater interest to politicians now than I have known, and it's an active conversation with the most senior politicians in government. In terms of the question about automation, it's an inevitability. It's just going to have to happen because the machine response times are so much faster, and it will be required. And how do you involve the lowest levels in capability decision making? Many years ago, when I was at university, I worked on the production line of assembling SA-80 rifles. I can tell you that the people on that production line knew much better how to optimize it than any of the managers. So we must do that. And actually, I think our system is really quite good at involving operators in helping think through the designs. But we have to be careful of is sometimes operators want the highest possible specification, and we haven't got time for that.
A lot of it's been said, so I'll keep this really, really tight. So on deterrence, I agree with Rich. There's a lot of focus on all things to do with nuclear and the way we operate our submarine force right now. From our perspective, when we talk about the credible, capable, and being communicative, we've got to make sure the credible and capable bit are squared away. And that's very much a Royal Navy issue, and it's a whole of government effort to communicate. And I think there's more of an appetite to do that now than even 12 months ago. So I'd watch this space because it is pretty active right now. Secondly, completely agree. You know, when I sat in an operations room back in the day, it was pretty hard you felt you were fighting to get the picture. Well, that picture has to be automated if we're going to deal with the sophisticated threats that we know are out there, to make sure that there is a human in there making the decision at the right moment. But I think over large theatres, maritime manoeuvre, you'll position your forces accordingly so that you have that ability to take the right decision at the right time. I'm always curious when I see task groups close together. That's not how we operate, or indeed right next to the beach. It's not how we operate, which implies that decision time is like that. And perhaps as the Moskva incident showed, if you calibrate that wrong, that's what could happen. And then finally on people, workforce, I recognize, First Sea Lord Fleet Command, we recognize that the best ideas are not going to be sat in a room, the three of us, working it out. And the people that are joining the Royal Navy are young Gen Z people who expect us to be moving at, you know, quick, smart and all of this. And we're changing all the business functionality. So people's careers, medical, kit, uniforms, all ordered themselves now. And there's more of that to come, as well as making sure that we set all of these innovation accelerators and indeed things like Percy Hobart Fellowship, and I know there are some supporters of that in this room. They come up with brilliant ideas, and most of them are not admirals. In fact, none of them are admirals. They're all ranks and mostly young, and it's important that we have the means to back those, and that's what we're increasingly going to do.
Thank you so much. We are about 180 seconds behind schedule, so thank you so much to all the speakers for their excellent contributions and their willingness to engage with the range of challenging questions from within the room, from the online audience. Before I invite you, if you're here at Arundel House, to grab a cup of coffee and be back in the room in 12 minutes, please, for the next panel chaired by my colleague Ben Barry. Can I invite you to thank our speakers in the usual way for a really excellent time? Thank you.